essentially, you remember from our report out last week that the idea of smoothings, the group thought it would be best to have a target number, which we've called the smoothing variable. So a certain target of percentage increase or decrease that would occur. That target smoothing variable would be the average of a certain number of assessment cycles. So it's looking back in time to come up with what is that particular variable. Then that would be applied to the actual values to determine the relative increase or decrease of that. Did that assessment cycle result in an increase or decrease that exceeded the smoothing value? If it did, then there would be adjustments made based upon the assessment rate to get to a second value, which would be the lower mark. So the idea is to have guardrails. So a top guardrail that would trigger the idea of having assessment rate reduction, and that rate reduction would go to a certain point to allow for districts to still have the revenue they need in a given time, but the upper limit, that smoothing variable, would be the top, so that in a given year there would have to be an overall state adjustment. So with that, I'll turn it over to the group. Is that your understanding of where we left it? The only thing that's different up on the screen than before is I broke out the determination of defining the smoothing variable first.
I think that's what we talked about.
So why did the group come up with that? Somebody go, Brenda first.
No, I wasn't gonna go first.
All right, I'll go first. I think the reason we were talking about this at all is because we were concerned about the extreme highs and lows in terms of how property value can change in general. And one of the things we continually heard was that if there's any way to trim off those extremes, that will create better balance, predictability, stability. Some of those items that were our criteria at the beginning, we would better meet those criteria if we were able to create I hate to use the word smooth, but a more smooth ride on the roller coaster, because that's what happens. This is a roller coaster that goes up and down, and when we're looking at the assessment rate and trying to minimize those changes, it means the tail end of the roller coaster won't go up or down as much as the front side, which is the actual value. So I think that was what we were trying to achieve. And instead of smoothing the entire thing, we were just saying, let's trim off the highs and the lows in order to still have some variability, but not have extreme variability.
Thanks for that. And before I see there's a couple of questions already online. One thing maybe the group should talk about too is, you did talk about actual value, like doing smoothing based on actual value, but decided against that. And maybe if someone would want to address that.
So I'm happy, this is Joanne, I'm happy to address that. We kind of dropped using actual value pretty early in our conversation, because using actual value is demanded by the Constitution, and we really didn't want to do anything that would conflict with the Constitution. The other is that we narrowed on the reappraisal window for real property, the 2-year reappraisal window for real property. That is statutorily mandated, so that can be amended to a different, but we thought stair-stepping within those 2 years, and then after those 2 years, using some reasonable percentage of actual value increase or decrease as being the trigger would keep us within the framework. So wasn't thinking outside the box quite as much as what we had been presented in December, but we thought it was totally doable within the confines of current reappraisal structure in the Constitution.
Thanks. So, Eileen, and then Cody.
Thank you. And some of you were able to meet our county assessor, Jay Yamashita, last week when I was absent, but he did provide some very enlightening feedback on this. And with all of these recommendations, there's going to be consequences, he said the assessment rate always lags market changes in either direction. Market changes reflect the reactions to the change in value, undervalued or overvalued assets. Further, the smoothing period, 4, 6, 8-year lookbacks, will also have a damping or lagging effect. The smoothing effect will effectively lead to an undervaluing of the assessed value of the most recent properties, residential or commercial, which are open-eye valued by the market and the new owner. Thus, the new cobbler owner will receive an effective tax saving resulting from their behavior at the expense of the longer-term owner. Something I hadn't really thought about, but I want to put it out there for us to think about. Thank you.
Comments from the group? The group did talk about the lagging nature, and that was actually one of the reasons they went to this particular formula was that if because actual values are already starting to decline or at least level off, that having relief based upon the past does affect the future. And so over time, the averaging would smooth out again the issue that's been raised by and that you just observed, Gavin. But anybody else want to join?
Well, I think that Jay is absolutely correct in that by smoothing, you're actually dealing with the taxes owed by the property, not necessarily the taxes owned by the property, or paid by the property owner, if that makes sense. So he's talking about a new owner is going to get the advantage of this where a long-term owner might not have. We really didn't take the ownership and how long people had owned the property into consideration. We were really looking at the tax obligation of that property. And as people move, they're going to get some advantage or not advantage. And from our presentation from the tax agents that we had 2 times ago, Mr. Bowling and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the other gentleman's name. I'm not sure this helps them, but I think ultimately it does if we're smoothing that out and we're not hitting the high peaks quite as quickly. But ultimately, this does not forgive any tax. This just slows down the payment of those taxes.
Cody?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty salient point that Mayor Castriota made. Mine was similar in that, and my assessor brought this up to me, that when the economy is in a bit of a tailspin like we saw in 2007, 2008, we could find ourselves at a point where people's properties are actually overvalued. And we got to put ourselves in that situation when, again, the economy's down, people are down in their luck, they find themselves paying more than what their property is worth on a smoothing effect. I think most of the time it's actually going to have a positive benefit, but there are times where it may actually have a negative externality, if you will.
So, Joanne, so how would the commission like to deal with that? So in general, is this an idea you want to continue to work with and make adjustments to along the lines of this discussion?
So you absolutely could say that you're not going to put this into effect with a 10% drop in values so that it only actually affects raises in when values rise. And you are limiting it to the 2-year reassessment cycles. So it's really just relieving the first year of the reassessment cycle so people can kind of get that under their belts before the second year of the reassessment cycle. The third year would be a new reassessment cycle. So a way to address not having this linger during harder times is to have it only affect if there's a 10% rise in value and not do it on the other side. Just an observation.
And the group didn't vote on 10%. You're just using that as
I'm
an
just
example.
using that as an example.
So your thought, Joanne, is make this apply only to increases. Sean?
I'm not sure that I agree with that. in the long run, it averages out. And we're trying to come up with a solution that's going to be valid for the long term. The first assessment is going to be the one that would be the damaging one, if you will, in the fact that not enough, or potentially not enough revenues would come in, or however the smoothing started. Once it began, it would average out. I don't see this as being, I do understand that yes, there are going to be times when people will be paying more than what their property is worth, but that is in an extreme circumstance that I don't know that we even saw that during the recession, where people were getting harmed by property taxes being too high at that time. So I'm not sure that I agree with putting the guardrail on only when the increase is there. But I think it should be there when the decrease is there, so that the taxing districts also have that predictability.
So keeping an increase and decrease would be predictable. And people could prepare, tax owners and districts. Senator Hanson or anybody else on this side of the table?
Yeah, Commissioner Doherty, I agree with that point actually, and I guess one of the things we can remember going through these cycles and thinking from the state budget side, it's exactly those moments when there's a spike in demand for local human services, for example. So having something that has some ballast in the tank, right, to smooth this out in both directions, it also has some upside when you think about that increase in demand for services. I guess just a question for the group on this one. I was trying to get a little more insight onto this target setting idea. When we launched this as a full commission and sent it to the breakout group, I think we were launching from this idea of like a 8, 6, 4 year averaging, right? We're going to do kind of multi-year as opposed to what we have now, which is 2 year assessment cycle. And I'm just kind of curious how the conversation went from that launch point to here, and then trying to understand this target idea a bit better.
Go ahead. Brenda.
Yeah, we ended up settling on just using a 2-year reassessment cycle because things can change so much, and yet if we stretch it out, although it makes it more smooth, it flattens it even more. We know that it'll also complicate the process more. So we still wanted to stay relatively current and make sure that we were reacting, especially in a downward market. Because as we're thinking always about an increasing market, and we've just talked about that, we know we want to hold it a little bit more flat, but in a downward market, we wanted to be really respectful of what those taxpayers need as well. So we felt like if we kept it smaller in that 2-year cycle, it actually was more responsive to what the taxpayers and taxing authorities would need in terms of being able to identify what was coming. And I'm trying to remember your second question.
Oh, it was really just about this target idea. Because it's not entirely clear to me what we've got on the screen, sort of how that target works with this proposal.
I'll hit it first. So we sort of said, we did generally say, what if value increases by 30%? Does that seem like it's excessive? And so we were saying we should set a target percent of, say, we always consider more than 10%, and if it goes above more than 10% and it went up 30%, then there was a 20% variable between 10% and 30%, and we would reduce that so that the increase was only half of what the total increase could be. So we said you can always go up, for example, 10%. We would identify what that was based on historical trends, and then we would say you can only go up so much more, maybe, and we were making up numbers, half of that. So if the increase was 10% plus 20%, you could only go up 10% more. So at most, it could go up 20%. Make sense?
And then how would sort of catch up happen over time?
Next year. Yeah.
So the next cycle?
The second year of the 2
The second year. Okay.
So the averaging was factored into how the smoothing variable would be determined. So thinking that if you look over the long course of time, the spikes occur rarely. And to get to the predictability, what is a guardrail that would have that adjustment apply in the spikes up or down? But otherwise, it would be business as usual. So really smoothing just the edges out, as the group said. So the previous cycles would come into setting the smoothing value, and that, say it was 10% growth, then the assessment rate would be set so that the growth would actually be 5%. So half of what the target is. So the smoothing variable is the upper limit of when action has to be taken to adjust the rates. And that would be set at an amount that is significantly higher than a normal kind of market fluctuation over time to trigger that event. When that event is triggered, then the idea, well, let's keep it at half of that. Is that fair to say, group?
You do
Lori?
look, you said it, Rennie, but you do look to the previous reassessment cycle determines whether you use smoothing, and then the value of the current reassessment cycle. So you look to what was the value of, in this case, we look to what was the value of the 2021 reassessment cycle. 2022, it looks like we're gonna go well over whatever the percentage is that we set. So then we would, in the first year, adjust the residential assessment rate and the commercial assessment rate down so that only half would be captured. And then the next year, they would catch up. So ultimately, taxpayers would be paying for that full 30% value increase, if you will. And we use as the manipulator the assessment rates.
Lori, did you want to jump in?
Actually, they have touched on most of the things that I was going to indicate, except one additional thing is by putting in that variable, that was our way of not making assessors' offices go through a lot of different formulas every single year. This is really to take those highest peaks and those lowest lows out of it, so that as we go through time, we are staying pretty close to the actual value. It will ultimately align.
So if it was averaged every year, then you'd have differences every single year. So that's another reason for the guardrails. So maybe because we have a lot of things on the agenda, are there other things
I just
on this
have one
before we
thing,
move on?
ready, yeah. And we looked at it both ways, when they went up and when they went down. If we take out the aspect of when rates or when values go down, then it's not smoothing anymore. So I think we need to be ever mindful that it goes both ways, and it needs to be both ways to be smoothing, or it's not. If we take one side out, it's not smoothing.
It's just a permit.
Yeah.
Permanent result.
Thank you. Okay, so, and perhaps you covered this, and my apologies for being like we're still on the floor. Talking about creating a smoothing variable based on, or, well, all of this is based on average increases or decreases in residential actual value. Is that number statewide, or is it, because the markets are different all over the state?
Yes, and the board statewide should be.
So I appreciate Rep. Frizzell's question, and I was sort of gonna go down the same road, which is one of the, one of the areas of greatest importance that we heard from the public across the state was that they want to see more of a move towards localization. Does this not move us in the opposite direction to that? And I guess using the example of, the map that we saw last week, or whenever it is that we last met, where you saw an increase of 43% in communities where I live, and then, decreases in some communities. How does this then impact communities, I guess, from community to community, when there are such big variables to what's happening with the market?
Who wants to take that from the group? Yes, Joanne.
So, it's gonna sound like I'm advocating for this much more than I really am. we looked at it at a statewide basis. There is no good breakdown to do it at the local level. You could go to counties and we could calculate rates by counties, but within counties, you have significant changes based on where you are in the county. My colleague from Weld County is an example. Certain areas of her county have very high increases in value, other areas of her county, very rural areas of the county have much lower increases in value. So you cannot break it down to the individual property level. That's just impossible. You can't break it down to the individual district level because districts overlap. So you get to a point where, as we discussed, that the legislature deals with state, the locals set their mill levies and deal with financing.
And I think the other idea, guardrails, I think were meant so that, recognizing that there are a lot of variations that go into that. So because of the smoothing, it would have dramatic effects than if it was adjusted every year. So that was another factor. Kevin, and then we're gonna wrap this part up and go to a thermometer vote here. Go ahead.
It would bug me if I didn't ask this. So any implications for revenue? Like, would there need to be any backfill provisions or anything on the revenue side in this sort of a scenario, do you think?
We did not discuss the revenue side of this particular smoothing activity. Districts will take what districts get out of the smoothing. We did talk about smoothing on other topics we discussed, but not on this one. Doesn't mean it can't be added, but we didn't talk about any kind of backfill.
Okay,
Just
so-
to tag on to the back end of that,
Sean.
if there was going to be a spike in revenues that would have exceeded the expected revenues of the district, really, that first year reduction would likely not affect the budgets as much because it was unexpected revenues. So that's what I see in the back of my head.
And again, over time, it'd be predictable. Somewhat. Okay, so Commission, what we propose now is after we complete these discussions, maybe not every single question's been answered here, but we've got a lot to cover today. So what we'd like to do is go to the Mentimeter and we'll pull up the QR code for that so that you can put your phone to that and dial into the Mentimeter. And you should see a slide and just vote on the first one. So we've put several of the topics on one slide, but we're just gonna take these one at a time. And so here the idea is disagree or agree, and just cast your vote and hit submit. You should tell us the, don't submit.
Just leave it on the first one.
Yeah, don't submit, thank you.
With the code,
Yeah.
I'm gonna take that from this page for a second. The code is 31952402, so if you wanna go to menti.com instead,
3195.
2402.
I have a clarifying question.
Just the first one.
Yes.
The order that I'm seeing them in is participatory separate school and local, smoothing residential assessments
Yes.
is third one. So are we just weighing in on that one?
Yes, please go to the third one down. So we changed up the agenda a little bit. Thank you for pointing that out. So just go to the smoothing one and put your selection in for that. Or don't put it in, but just move your thermometer to where you want it to be. Okay, thanks. Angela. Okay, so with that, let's go to our. Yeah, I think what we're gonna do from here forward is just, we're gonna hold all the voting until the end. So remember how you're thinking about this. And that's just because of the tool. How we set the tool up, so is that okay, or maybe we should stop and have the commission? Do you wanna take a consensus view now, or just remember where you are in these and then we'll come back to it?
got a few
Yeah,
things, nobody's, I think this works one pretty way or well. the other. I mean, they're just all on one page, and as we go, we'll just enter our 1 through 5 score.
Right, just on it, but the group won't be able to see how it's coming out until the end, which is fine.
Very good, very good.
Okay. All right, let's go to the second assessments recommendation, which basically dealt with the assessment rate on non-residential, and to summarize where the work group came out was to modify the vacant land and non-residential rates, but not oil and gas, to hit a target value over time. And so, for example, a target assessment rate of 25.5 would be a target. There would be a point in time out in the future where assessment rates on non-residential would gradually go down. The rate of decline would be such that it would allow for flexibility of local districts to be able to raise or lower their mills. And if, given the variations across the state and across districts, if there was a significant loss to districts, then the state would backfill that for a given period of time. So still some unknowns here, but the general idea is to gradually reduce the non-residential rate to get to a point and to allow for districts to go to the voters, adjust their mills in between, and provide relatively shorter term relief with state backfill only to those districts who are the outliers in terms of how this applied to their districts. So, assessments work group, basis for this, and anything to add to that summary? Okay, nobody wants to weigh in? Say it's all explanatory. Questions from the commission about the thought process, the proposal, anything else that the work group can answer? Anne?
Yes, it is pretty straightforward. The question is if for some reason a school district or a local government wasn't able to pass a mill levy increase, because that's at the local level, is there anything in place then that would take that temporary backfill to a permanent backfill? Was there a discussion about that piece?
Work group.
Okay.
You're shaking your head. Say something for the record.
For the record, no, there was no discussion about backfilling forever. Or if local governments weren't able to convince their constituencies. And as we recognize the all other category that we're talking about, there are many districts that won't affect them at all because they are so dominantly residential property, but there are some that are going to really be affected. So we thought, the one thing that we really thought was not to do this all at once, that we need to stagger it in over time rather than immediately go to a lower assessment rate, so that districts can absorb those changes and have some predictability on those changes.
And while we didn't specifically not talk about permanent backfill, we did specifically say that we wanted temporary, just because that's the fairest way to get this in place if we've got to step down right.
And we didn't define temporary.
That's true.
And we were given a good opportunity to see some data and actually make some changes to assessment rates to be able to evaluate the impact that was occurring for different districts. And so we could see that some districts were going to be affected by a 1% change in assessment rate or a 4% change in assessment rate. We could see that they were going to be affected at 10% or 0.4%. And so that's what led us to believe that temporary backfill would be reasonable and gradual step down made sense in order for those districts to be able to start adjusting and working with their taxpayers.
I just had was there discussion about set a target that you were trying to reach?
I think we used the 25.5 for the commercial rate because that's what we had heard initiatives, and they were representing businesses when we heard from BOMA, and those tax agents, and so they were talking about something along those lines, so we were using that as a general target. For vacant land, we didn't come up with a specific rate, but we were saying it should be in between residential and the commercial rate. We thought that should be a separate percentage.
The database that the legislative council's put together can really be useful to have what is a meaningful assessment rate reduction and achievable without creating a lot of chaos in the districts. And the group really didn't have time to see many different scenarios, so this is just the starting point, but the idea would be the same. And I see a lot of different hands here, but you want to
Really quickly, just the other piece, was there much discussion on sort of, we'd say temporary backfill, like length and 100%, 50%? How did the discussion go on that front?
Commissioner Kerr, that was your idea, I think. What you have in mind there?
Oh, great, get me by the chair under the table here, but, yeah, it just, I mean, in my mind, it's almost like the smoothing conversation, just to smooth the edges off. But while we didn't define temporary, obviously, I mean, I understand the appetite for long-term or permanent backfilling from the state to locals. There's not much appetite in that building for that. There is widespread appetite for reducing these other rates. But if we are going to do that, there has to be some sort of protection in place, at least in a temporary way to smooth the edges off. If they're by the stair step that we're doing, if we get to a point where we're impacting local government's ability to provide services, there needs to be some sort of protection there in my mind.
So, Bailey had a question, or wants to jump in?
I think I just wanted to echo my colleague with, the fiscal gap concerns, because our schools and our local governments are heavily dependent on that non-residential tax revenue, since Gallagher ratcheted down the other side. So it's just gonna be a difficult balance to ensure that we don't have these huge fiscal gaps, which lead to cuts in services. And when I hear backfill, I mean, we all know the state doesn't have backfill. So to fall back on that is just, it's fraught with peril.
Do we have an estimate of sort of where we are today, 25 and 25, what that would mean in impact? Is that part of your discussion?
It was plugged into the table, but I don't remember what. It wasn't super dramatic, to be honest, statewide. I mean, Brenda, go ahead.
We didn't have a full estimate. What was interesting is that you would think if you were reducing the non-residential rate from 27.9 to 25.5, we're talking about commercial property, who's gonna be impacted? That's gonna be Denver. And that was not the impact. So the impact was on smaller rural areas. And so that's why the data was so valuable and led us to believe that some of the larger areas might actually be able to absorb a small decline in value and percentage loss, whereas some of the smaller ones are going to be the ones that are more impacted and require more of that backfill because they're not going to be able to get it from anywhere else. So I think the data is where we're going to have to rely on in order to make good educated decisions about who can handle it, and then what would a percentage change be for allowing backfill or having temporary backfill.
And, as part of the data, just to back that up, we just didn't have enough time to go through it all, but, it's a super strong tool where we backed out oil and gas, backed out residential. We were able to put all the other groupings in there to get an idea. And then, you can go down 0.5% every year, or 1/4%, or whatever, and see what that impact is. And you can see that, per county and per district. That tool is that strong. But, I think the biggest decline we saw was just below 10%. So, in some of those rural counties that don't have, so it's not, it surprised us, I think, that, not that they're not important, that was not the intent of that, but, that we could see a way to, create a little more balance between residential, non-residential, and allow, opportunities to minimize the impact.
Was there, I thought there was a hand on this, Commissioner Richardson, Lauren, go first, I think your hand's up.
Thank you, Rennie. Thank you, Chair. I appreciate this group's, work on this issue and trying to identify somebody for commercial property. I know we haven't had a lot of time to discuss this. I'm just curious though, why the exemption of oil and gas? You went into that a little bit, but can you explain a little bit more?
We really didn't have a lot of conversation about it. We didn't even address whether oil and gas should be reduced. I think we have watched over the years that the rate on oil and gas doesn't get addressed, and we just made an assumption that that would be true going forward.
And when you looked at the presentation that was made by the 198 group, the two gentlemen that presented there, you saw in their proposal, they're also excluding the oil and gas. Oil and gas and natural resources are valued. Extracted natural resources are valued quite differently in the state, and of course, oil and gas gets an income tax credit for the property tax they pay, unlike any other, in a way that's different than other taxpayers, so we took it out. If we were gonna make a recommendation, the only thing we'd recommend is that oil and gas should be taken out of any calculations that we do anywhere, because it's such a volatile base. On Gallagher, for instance, if oil and gas had a bad year, you would see the Gallagher rate not lower as much. If they had a fabulous year, just the opposite. If they had a fabulous year, you would see the Gallagher rate not drop as much because there was more value in the all other category. The problem with that is that oil and gas is not a resource that's statewide. And so even though you have some districts that have less commercial and more commercial, you have even fewer districts that have oil and gas or not oil and gas. It's great if you have it, or when it's growing, and it's bad when you don't. I'm sure that my colleague from Wells County could go into that a little bit more. But it was mostly, it's not been included in any of the reductions. Even back in 1982, when they did the property tax amendment that included Gallagher, did they address oil and gas?
Thank you. Very helpful.
Just quickly mention here, I mean, changing oil and gas is fundamentally about how much do locals get and how much does the state get. Because if we lowered it from 87.5 down to 50, just pick a number, it just means our severance tax for the state would go way up. So that is fundamentally a conversation about who gets how much of that pie. Now, if we want to have another discussion about total taxation and effective severance, right? You open up a whole can of worms. But it's really fascinating to me, and unlike the other parts of our discussion, the moment you touch property tax for oil and gas, you're essentially saying send more to Denver.
So we have Chris and then John.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of ones. The gradually lower, did you discuss the time frame of when you'd like to get to a target? And if not, that's fine. I'm just curious.
We did not talk about a time frame because, again, we really wanted to do it based on, to have data-driven decisions in order to make sure that we weren't impacting those taxing authorities.
Yeah, and just the other, you explained where the 25.5 came from. I was curious because it's still a pretty high multiple. And then I guess in the backfill always makes me nervous because it's never certain, and it also impacts potentially voters determining whether they want to take on that local responsibility or hope that the state will. Why should I vote keep the taxes higher if the state's going to think those are, you had something there, Bob?
Well, I wanna tell you that there was a lot of discussion about local control, and I think the intent of that bill was to allow the locals to have an opportunity to react or catch up, but it was not going to be the all savior where they could, have a tax savings because the burden would be shifted. That was not the intent, it would never, I don't think we could, approve it if it was even written that way going into next year. The idea was to not collapse something, give them that final opportunity to educate their voters and get, a local alternative, back in place. So timelines, 2 years maybe, you know?
Yeah, fair enough, thank you.
Jonathan?
Thank you. My question is, this kind of reminded me of, it's the opposite of the land value. I'm not sure if you're supposed to bring that word anymore, but. Often you use, vacant property taxes as an incentive for it to not remain vacant and developed. That's not always a good thing in like rural areas, but residential areas where it's blighted, you want to do that. At this step, it's like a very mild step, so it doesn't really matter. But eventually, it depends on how far you're going down. How are you thinking about what a very low vacant property tax rate eventually would do for development, especially in blighted areas?
Brenda or Sean, because we did talk, the group talked about this.
We did talk a little bit about this. I think a number that came out just as a what if was around 15. But there still needs to be incentive for vacant parcels that can be developed to be developed. But on the flip side of it, I think that there are many people being harmed right now with the recent decoupling of vacant land that had been combined in with improved land. They're now getting taxed at different rates, and that's a completely unexpected situation. And sometimes you can't develop these parcels. And if we're not allowed to, if an owner is not allowed to combine that into another improved parcel, they're getting unfairly taxed, let's say landlocked parcels, things along those lines, or mountainous regions. So we did definitely talk about this. We did not go into blighted properties. And I don't know enough about whether they get classified differently. But part of the reason, though, again, for vacant, unimproved land was to try to give an opportunity for someone or a family or an owner who's had it in their hands for a long time to get out from being unfairly taxed. So that was the thoughts. I hope that answers what you were.
Jonathan actually asked my question because I was curious about the vacant land.
Any other, Joanne?
So during our conversation, one of the things that exists is vacant, what we call vacant land discounting, where if you're a large developer and you're developing a particular property, you're developing properties and you're ready to go on developing, but you're selling lots. Those lots get a discount from the they get discounted over time until the lots are sold or until the development has a particular saturation point. So you could, to encourage development, lower or affect that vacant land discounting so that there's more incentive to develop more quickly. I think what we were talking about here was really more the smaller, might not be a small parcel, but the smaller owner that owns a parcel, bought a parcel years ago in a neighborhood looking to self-develop, and now they're paying pretty outrageous property tax bills. Once they start developing that land, they'll be paying less property tax on it, but the land value has increased so much because of where it is. That's what we're talking about. And I think from a voting standpoint, maybe we should separate the two concepts. So that would that mess you up?
No, it's your recommendation. So
Separate from
vacant as
The vacant
separate.
land separate, as a separate vote over over the commercial lowering, the step down, two different concepts.
Yeah, just a quick point, having been involved in the vacant land discussion over the last few years, the bar to integrate it into the improved parcel is very low. Gazebo, shed, trail with a bench, I mean, it's a pretty low bar, so I hear that, but I also just wanted to point out that we tried to write that in a way where it was relatively easy to integrate it into an improved parcel.
This was much less about your contiguous lots issue that you're talking about, and much more about the person that has, the individual that's gone out there. We all got a letter, I believe, from a gentleman that had participated in Colorado Springs. If we didn't get that letter, I'll make sure that you guys get it, because we got it also separately as individual members. But they were talking about, they have 2 lots, and the cost of the cost to them, because there are no improvements yet on that land. But I don't know that we were particularly married to it.
So, Representative.
Thank you. So, I've thought a lot about the commercial assessment rate for years, actually. Because there's a stark difference between the way residential property's been taxed over time and commercial property, non-residential property, simply because the residential rate was allowed to float. And it seems to me that a good way to step this down would be according to increases in those property classification types. So, if you have an increase in the retail market, and again, I don't think this is a statewide calculation, then you can decrease the assessment rate for that property accordingly. And that way, that addresses Mayor Castriata's concerns about really eroding the tax base by artificially decreasing. So you can hold it from a tax perspective the same, or reduce if that's the decision that the committee comes up with. But I feel like there are other mechanisms that are more organic to decreasing the rate. And perhaps that's a different conversation.
Well, the group actually did start out with narrowing down to different classifications, if I'm following what you're saying, and looked at having adjusting just different classifications within non-residential, and I think group speak to why you landed on this as opposed to that. That was one of the things that was talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm always interested in hearing what other ideas are out there. We didn't talk a lot about other ideas except saying that as change of use happens, because commercial property or non-residential property can have change of use, we didn't want it to be swimming around in terms of what that assessment rate was. And so I'm not 100% sure if that's what you're alluding to, but because it sounded like you were saying a different rate based on the use of the property specifically.
No, I'm just talking about changing the rate according to the change in value. So from a reappraisal to a reappraisal, we see changes in the level of value, and sometimes the retail market is different from the office market in downtown Denver, it for sure is. But in other areas, it may be the same. So I think, it's a very nuanced conversation, but it would allow a mechanism to step that assessment rate down, to acknowledge that change in value.
And I think that part of this is about making sure we're recognizing that we're hoping to step the rate down, but we aren't trying to decimate the system by any means. And so if there's an increase in value, of course, that's a good time to be stepping down the rate. But even if there's not a significant increase in value, I think we were still saying that we believe that differential between residential and non-residential is extreme, and so we should be taking action to still address that one way or the other, just doing it at a very gradual rate, which is why we had all of this, sort of relaxed language in terms of a gradual step down with a temporary backfill with nothing very defined. So we'd be open to more, exploration of the topic.
Any thoughts, and this maybe is great for our assessors and former assessors, is thought between, you know, the market versus income and approaches for valuation there. Does that reduce that disparity, or does it accentuate this disparity? Because I guess my observation is, looking at different parts of commercial, the income rate actually makes that effective assessment rate lower. And is the disparity as big as it looks just from those two headline numbers?
Well, I think we heard this from, when Mr. Pauling, Mr. Van Dunsler were here speaking to us, because they were talking about, you know, what they perceive and what can be really stark differences in how properties are valued. The reality is assessors have specific information that they know, and what that is sales of properties for particular uses. They don't have specific income and expense information for properties, and typically will only utilize that approach, at least on a property-specific basis, after that property has appealed and that information is made available, because it is proprietary information and there is not a lot of, historically, there has not been great interest in property owners or managers providing income and expense information to assessors to value property. That's just the reality. We've kind of fought back and forth on it over years and have successfully worked together with industry to pass some bills that have helped, but there's still not a great impetus for that to happen. So I understand where Mr. Pauling and Mr. Van Dunsler were coming from, because we've lived this, but and there is a difference. There can be a good difference between an income approach and a market approach and a cost approach, but we usually try to stick with the income and market approaches. And perhaps the assessor would like to chime in.
So I think we need to, thank you for that, and I think we need to wrap this one up. And Joy made the recommendation that we have this one be pertaining to non-residential assessments except oil and gas, and that reducing the rate on vacant land be separately stated. Is that something what the group is good with doing? The assessment group? So we'll just add that question later on. So with this, anything more on this? Because we'll go on to the next group, which is local control. So we can get through everything we need to do today. So good discussion, and I'll turn it over to Christine and Ernest.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.